On the morning of the 23rd of December, 1972, 2 days before Christmas, a convoy of unmarked cars pulled up outside a villa in the Sweezy district of Rabat. Inside that villa were a woman of 37, her 6 children, and 2 women who had spent their lives in the household. The youngest child was a boy named Abdelatif. He was 3 years old. He had only just learned to talk. The eldest was a young woman named Malika. She was 19 and she had spent more than half of her life living inside a royal palace as the companion of a princess. They were given almost no time to gather their things. They were told they were being taken somewhere for their own safety. And what no one told them, what almost no one outside a small circle of powerful men would know for the next 15 years, was that these cars were carrying them into the Sahara to be erased. No charge, no trial, no paper anywhere admitting they still drew breath. 6 weeks before this morning, the father of those 6 children had been the second most powerful man in Morocco, the man the king trusted with everything. Now he was lying in an unmarked grave in a mountain village with 5 bullets in his body, and the man who had put them there wore the crown. This is the story of what a king does to the people he cannot forgive, and it is the story of how 6 children answered him with a spoon, a sardine tin, and a tunnel dug by hand. It was 1955, and a lean, soft-spoken army officer was standing at the side of a returning king. His name was Mohamed Oufkir. He had been born in 1920 in a hard, dry corner of southeastern Morocco into a Berber family that had served whoever held power. He had fought for France at Monte Cassino, taken a wound in the night, and come home wearing a French war medal and an American one. He was clever, fearless, and almost impossible to read. And when Mohammed V came back from exile to lead a newly independent Morocco, Oufkir made himself indispensable at the king's elbow. When Mohammed V died and his son Hassan II took the throne in 1961, Oufkir did not fade. He rose. He was made head of national security, then a general, then Minister of the Interior. On paper, those are titles about order and administration. In practice, Oufkir became the instrument the throne reached for whenever it needed something done that no one wanted their name attached to. When the Rif region rose up in protest, it was Oufkir who put it down, and the foreign press started calling him a butcher. When riots broke out in Casablanca in March of 1965, hundreds of people died in the streets, and the stories that filtered out described Oufkir directing the response from above, from a helicopter. Whether every grim detail was literally true almost stopped mattering. The legend was the point. To be feared was the job. And then there was Paris. In October of 1965, a Moroccan opposition leader named Mehdi Ben Barka, the most famous critic the monarchy had, was lured to a Paris street, bundled into a car, and never seen alive again. A French court looked at the evidence named Mohamed Oufkir and convicted him in his absence of involvement in the kidnapping. France sentenced him to life. Morocco simply refused to hand him over. Sit with that for a moment, because it matters for everything that comes later. The man who would one day watch his own family disappear without a trace had built his entire career on making other people's families disappear without a trace. The machine that would one day swallow his children whole was a machine he helped build. He just never imagined it would be turned around to face him. By the end of the 1960s, Oufkir was the most powerful subject in the kingdom. He had a beautiful wife named Fatéma, whom he had married in 1952 when she was barely 16. He had 6 children, and one of those children had been chosen for something almost unimaginable. When Malika, his eldest, was 5 years old, the royal family had taken her into the palace to be raised alongside the king's youngest daughter, Princess Lala Mina. She grew up inside those walls, tutored by a French governess dressed like a princess, sharing the private world of the monarchy itself. She would later say she spent her childhood as a kind of living gift, given by one powerful family to another. Remember that too, because the same little girl who was raised as a daughter of the palace would one day be buried alive by it. On the 10th of July 1971, King Hassan II threw himself a birthday party at his seaside palace at Skirat. He was turning 42. Hundreds of guests, foreign diplomats, a hot afternoon by the sea, and then more than 1,000 military cadets stormed the grounds with rifles. It was a coup attempt, led by senior officers, and it turned the garden party into a massacre. Around 90 people were killed, including a foreign ambassador. The king himself hid, and at one point reportedly survived only because the young soldiers, when they finally found him, recognized him and faltered. When the smoke cleared, Hassan II turned to the one man he believed had stayed loyal through the carnage. He turned to Oufkir. In front of everyone, the king handed him sweeping new powers and made him Minister of Defence and head of the entire armed forces. It was the peak. Oufkir was now, without question, the second most powerful man in Morocco. The throne's sword and shield. That proximity to the crown was the thing that had built him. It was also, though no one could see it yet, the thing that would destroy his family. Because when you stand that close to a throne, there is no neutral ground left to stand on. You are either the king's man, completely, or you are his most dangerous enemy. There is no third option. And in just over a year, Hassan II would decide which one Oufkir was. The 16th of August 1972, the king's private Boeing 727 was flying him home from a trip to France. As it approached Moroccan airspace, Moroccan fighter jets, F-5 jets, scrambled from a Moroccan airbase, climbed up to meet it and opened fire on their own king's plane. Cannon rounds tore into the fuselage. The aircraft should not have survived, but Hassan II had trained as a pilot, and what he did next became legend. He grabbed the radio himself, pretended to be a lowly crew member, and told the attacking pilots that their target was already finished. He told them the tyrant was dead. The pilots, believing they had won, broke off. The shredded jet limped down onto the runway. The king walked away from it alive. On the ground, the rebels strafed the airport anyway, and 8 more people died before it was over. Within hours, the king had a name for the world. He pointed at the man he had trusted above all others. He pointed at Oufkir. To this day, historians argue about how deep Oufkir was really in it. Some are convinced he masterminded the whole thing, planning to rule through the king's young son. Others think he was a convenient corpse to hang it on. We may never fully know. What is not in dispute is what happened to him that night. The government announced that General Oufkir had taken his own life out of shame. That was the official story. A suicide. There was one small problem with that story. When his family was finally allowed near his body, his daughter Malika counted the wounds herself. She did not count 1, she counted 5. 5 bullets in the back, the stomach, the chest, the neck. And no, that is not an exaggeration invented decades later. It is her account, and it lines up with what later investigators and historians concluded independently. If a single odd detail were all there was, you could maybe call it a tragedy with an ugly rumour attached. But the wounds were not survivable as a suicide. The official version of events changed more than once, and the scholarly consensus today is blunt about it. Mohamed Oufkir did not kill himself. He was executed, almost certainly by men loyal to the throne, and the story of the suicide was stitched on afterward. In Morocco, people gave it a name. They called it the suicide of 5 bullets. A whole country understood in those 4 words exactly what kind of justice it was looking at and exactly how little it could say out loud. They buried him in his ancestral village without ceremony. And the king turned his attention to what was left of the man, his name, his house, his widow, and his 6 children. Suisi, Rabat, the 23rd of December, 1972, 4 months after the father's death, the cars came for the rest of the family. We are back at that morning, 2 days before Christmas. The mother, Fatéma, the 6 children from 19-year-old Malika down to 3-year-old Abdelatif, and 2 more women, Ashura, Fatéma's cousin, and Halima, who had helped raise the children. 9 people in all, loaded up and driven south. This is the moment that turns a coup into a horror story. Because the children had done nothing. The youngest could barely form a sentence. Their only crime was the surname they carried. The first place they were taken was a walled house inside a remote army post near the edge of the Sahara, a place called Assa. And here is the cruel part of the early years. At Assa, it was almost survivable. They had bread, some meat, a radio, even a few guards who had once worked in their own home and treated them with a strange, sad kindness. For a while, the family told themselves this was exile, not prison, that the king would cool down, that someone would remember them and let them go home. If the story had ended at Assa with a few hard years and then a quiet release, it would be a sad footnote in a history book. It did not end at Assa. What was coming would make Assa feel like a holiday. They did not know it, but a clock had already started. Every month the world did not ask about them was a month the regime grew more certain that it could simply let them rot. And the longer the silence held, the deeper into the desert they went. In November of 1973, they were moved to a ruined fortress called Tamattatt, an old mud-walled fort out past the mountains. 9 people in 2 rooms, a hole in the floor for a toilet, the radio that became their only window onto a world that had forgotten them. They listened to it like a lifeline, hearing about a planet that was moving on without them. Songs, news, other people's ordinary days. That radio and the small ordinary objects scattered around their cells would matter later in a way none of them could have imagined. They did not know yet that survival would one day come down to what a clever, desperate person can do with the contents of a prison cell. They were just trying to live through the day. The years ground on. The children grew up against those walls with no schooling, no future. No idea if their imprisonment had a number on it or no end at all. And by early 1977, after more than 4 years of it, the family did something that tells you everything about how far gone they were. They wrote a letter to the king, a plea for mercy. And to make him believe how serious they were, they signed it in their own blood. Think about what that letter actually was. It was a family of children, abandoned in a desert ruin by their own country, cutting themselves to beg the most powerful man in that country for the simple right to be treated like human beings. That is not a request you make to someone you think is reasonable. It is a request you make to someone you are terrified of. The king's answer to the letter, written in blood, was not mercy. His answer was to move them somewhere far worse. A quick word before we go on, because what comes next is the part of this story that is genuinely hard to sit with. If you believe the people history erased deserve to be remembered by name, that is the entire reason this channel exists, and following along is the simplest way to keep these stories from disappearing a second time. That is all. Now, back to the family. While the family was being driven deeper into the country, something else had been quietly built and was waiting for them. A purpose-made place of disappearance roughly 45 kilometers south of Casablanca. It was called Bir-Jdid. And in February of 1977, the family was sealed inside it. This was not a walled house with a radio and sympathetic guards. This was a prison designed to make people vanish from the inside out. Armoured doors, no windows, no electricity, scorpions and rats and fleas. Starvation rations passed through a slot. And the cruelest design choice of all, they were separated. The four sisters were locked together in one cell. The mother kept little Abdelatif, who is now around 8, with her. The two household women were in another cell. And Raouf, the only grown son, the regime's idea of the dangerous one, was locked entirely alone. For 10 years, that was the world. A corridor of buried people who could hear each other through the walls but rarely see one another. They invented a code of taps to talk. They smuggled words back and forth like contraband. And one by one, the human beings inside started to break. The family later described one stretch as the worst of all of it, a season of total collapse. The mother attempted to take her own life. So did Raouf, alone in his cell. Malika nearly died from a burst infection with no doctor, no medicine, and lost her hair. And Miriam, one of the sisters who suffered from epilepsy, had her medication taken away and spent the better part of 8 years lying bedridden in the dark. While Malika was fighting to keep the others alive in the sisters' cell, her brother Raouf, a few walls away, was losing years of his life to a silence so complete that he would later say he sometimes forgot the sound of his own voice. The guards burned the family's belongings, their photographs, the small proofs that they had ever been a family with a normal life, with birthdays and a house and a father. The state was not just imprisoning them, it was trying to delete them from existence, to make it so that one day no one could prove the children had ever been real. And it was in that darkness, with nothing, that a handful of starving prisoners started planning the impossible. In January of 1987, after a routine cell search, the sisters began to dig. Their tools were the contents of a prison cell: a spoon, the handle of a knife, the lid of a sardine tin sharpened, an iron bar pried from a bed frame. With those in secret between searches, they began scraping a tunnel into the floor of their cell and through the earth beneath the prison. They had no engineering, no plan beyond out, and no real idea what was on the other side. What they had was the one thing the regime had spent 15 years trying to take from them and somehow could not reach: the refusal to be erased. On the night of the 19th of April, 1987, 4 of them went through it: Malika, her sister Maria, her brother Raouf, and Abdelatif, the boy who had been 3 years old when the cars came, now 18, who had no memory of the outside world at all. 3 of the family stayed behind on purpose. Sukaina sealed the tunnel behind them to hide the escape for as long as possible. Miriam was far too ill to move, and their mother, Fatéma, stayed to slow the guards and buy the others time. Picture the boy for a second. Abdelatif had spent 15 of his 18 years behind those doors. He had never crossed a street. He stepped out of a hole in the ground into a country he had only ever heard on a smuggled radio. For 5 days, the 4 of them moved across the country by taxi and by bus, trying to reach the north and slip across to Spain. People they knew refused to take them in, terrified of what helping a vanished family would cost. A stranger finally gave them shelter. And then Malika did the boldest thing of all. She got to a telephone and she called a radio station in Paris. She told the outside world that the family was alive, that they existed, that the children Morocco had erased 15 years earlier were real and breathing and on the run. For the first time since 1972, the secret was out of the regime's hands. This is the moment the story tilts. Remember the silence, the thing that had let the regime grow so comfortable, letting them rot. A single phone call broke it. Once the world had heard their voices, the family could no longer simply disappear again. They were recaptured on the 24th of April in the north before they could cross. After 5 days of freedom, they were dragged back. But the thing they had set loose could not be recaptured. That small detail, 4 desperate people and 1 phone call came back to haunt the throne exactly as the regime had once haunted others. In 1990, a French writer named Gilles Perrault published a book that tore the polite mask off Morocco's monarchy and laid out its hidden prisons in detail, the family among them. It caused a diplomatic earthquake between France and Morocco. Human rights organizations took up the family's name. Their existence, once a state secret, was now an international embarrassment that would not go away. The pressure worked slowly. A few months after the escape, the family had already been moved out of the prison cells and into house arrest, watched but no longer buried. And in February of 1991, after the better part of 19 years, they were finally, formally released. But released is a generous word. They had no passports. They were watched. They could not leave the country. They had simply traded a small cage for a larger one. So in 1996, they ran one more time. Maria slipped out first, crossing through the Spanish enclave of Ceuta and reaching Paris, where she demanded asylum and made the family's case impossible to ignore once more. Under the glare of the press, the Moroccan authorities finally announced that there was, in their words, no more Oufkir affair. The passports came. And that summer, Malika, Raouf and Soukaina boarded planes and left Morocco for France. From the cars in Swissi in December 1972 to free passports in 1996, the better part of 24 years had passed. Of those, roughly 19 were spent in actual imprisonment, and the years after release were spent watched and grounded. When people say 20 years in a desert jail, that is the span they mean. 2 decades in which an entire family was stolen out of the world. The 3-year-old came out a grown man. The 19-year-old came out in her 40s. So here is the question this channel always comes back to. The cars drove them into the Sahara to erase them. Did it work? Where is the family now? Start with Malika. The girl who was raised in the palace and then buried by it sat down and wrote the whole thing into a book. In France, it was called La Prisonnière. In English, Stolen Lives. In 2001, it was chosen for Oprah's book club and read by millions of people who had never heard the name Oufkir in their lives. The state had burned the family's photographs to make sure no one could ever prove they existed. Malika answered by putting their story on bookshelves in dozens of languages, where it can never be burned again. She married a French architect in 1998 and built a life in Paris. The little girl the regime tried to delete became the reason the whole world knows the family's name. Her brother Raouf, the son who lost most of 2 decades to a solitary cell, did not stay silent either. He wrote his own account of the years inside, a long, detailed book of everything he had endured. He earned a graduate degree, worked as a journalist, and split his life between Paris and Rabat, a free man in the country that once buried him. While Raouf was telling the men's story of those years, his sisters were rebuilding lives of their own across Paris. Maria, who had crawled through the tunnel and then crossed at Ceuta to break the family free, became a costume and set designer in French cinema, working on films and television. She adopted a son. Soukaina, who had stayed behind to seal the tunnel so the others could run, grew up to be an artist and a musician, releasing her own music and later writing her own memoir of being a child raised in the king's prisons. Miriam, the sister whose epilepsy medicine was taken away, who spent years bedridden in the dark, eventually crossed an ocean. She settled in California and went to work with children with disabilities, caring for the kind of vulnerable people the world overlooks, having been overlooked herself for so long. And then there is Abdelatif, the 3-year-old from the beginning of this story. The boy who had only just learned to talk when the cars came, who knew nothing of the world but a radio and a cell, who stepped out of a tunnel at 18 into a country he had never touched. He is alive today, a man in his 50s. He spent his entire childhood, every single year of it, as a prisoner of the state. For a coup, he was a toddler during. Their mother, Fatéma, the woman of 37 from the beginning, lived to be 78. She wrote her own book defending the husband the world remembered as a butcher, the man she had married at 16. She died in Morocco in December of 2013, in the country that had taken everything from her, and her family buried her quietly, with the press turned away at the gate. 6 children went into the desert to be forgotten. Not one of them was. They came out and they wrote and they sang and they raised other people's children, and they put their own names back into the historical record with their own hands. The regime spent 20 years trying to prove that a family could be erased without consequence. Instead, it produced the most thoroughly documented family in modern Moroccan history. That is not an accident. That is the last word in an argument the throne thought it had already won. Go back to that morning, the 23rd of December, 1972. The unmarked cars outside the villa in Swissi. The 3-year-old who had just learned to talk. The convoy shrinks down a long, straight road into nothing, carrying a family into the Sahara to be erased. That convoy is still the first image of this story, but you see it differently now, because we know how the road ends. It doesn't end in the desert. It ends in Paris, on a bookshelf, in a film studio, in a recording, in a California classroom full of children. It ends with the family driving back out of the silence the king built for them, and refusing, every single one of them, to disappear. The crown thought it had the final say. It almost always does, and almost always, somewhere down the road, a family that was supposed to vanish finds a way to speak. If this story stayed with you, there is another family on this channel that a throne tried to erase. An empress and her children driven out of their own country with almost nothing. The exiled Queen of Iran. Their story is waiting for you right here, and it is one you will not forget.